And the reason I'm here today is because, like Ian, I'm a trustee of the Radiation Research Trust. Ian is a much better person than me to chair this session because he is at the very least scientifically trained. And the contribution that I have always tried to make to this subject is to try and make sure that it is science that predominates, because it is an area where there is a great deal of concern and fear and scare. And it seems to me that it is through the science of all of this that we manage to make some progress in identifying risks and laying scares, hopefully, to rest. I became involved some time ago through Eileen, who is a constituent of mine, and who I think has done a fantastic job in bringing this subject to much wider attention. And indeed it was through her that the Radiation Research Trust got set up and Ian and my involvement began. So I shall now slide quietly away and leave matters to Ian. And I think we are hugely privileged to have such an eminent speaker this afternoon. And I know that he's preparing to speak for half an hour and then to answer questions, which I think will be valuable. So you're all very welcome to the House of Commons, and I hope very much the session will shed some light on a very important area. Thank you very much for your time.
I hope you're taking public transport and running CO2 into the atmosphere.
I can't be using my mobile phone on the way.
Okay, well, I hope there's no maths around today. Thank you very, very much all for coming. Indeed, I sort of lived with this problem through constituents coming to see me in local papers campaigning on the issue for several years now. And it's something that won't go away as far as constituents in Norwich are concerned and right across the country. And although we don't have the kind of evidence that we might need to make the rational sort of scientific decisions which are, pretty foolproof, not that science is ever foolproof, but it's pretty good at it at sometimes getting things right. It knows a virus from a bacterium, for example, that causes a disease. We can find things out. I think a lot of people are very demanding of more work being done in this field to find out what the problems are. I joined the Radiation Trust because I've always been concerned about low levels of radiation, be they overhead pylons, or whatever. And as somebody who did genetics, when genetics was always an offshoot of botany in the old days, we were taught that no radiation is really good for you, that there's always some kind of mutation takes place and so on. Well, you have to balance that up, of course, against the benefits. I mean, science is about benefits and risks, and that's what this debate is about. And the public have made their decision for whatever reason. I'm not going to hear about that today, but as the science moves forward, I think it helps to inform the debate. So we're very, very fortunate today, I think, to have somebody who's a very distinguished academic who's come across from the United States. And they're not always the best scientists, I always used to say that, but they're pretty good at it because they're well funded and they can do research. So as we're looking forward to hearing how good your research is and what kind of results you have, please try and convince us.
Okay. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you, and this is indeed an honor for me, and I hope that what I can share with you over the next 30 minutes or so will be of use to you as you move forward in trying to solve this ever-evolving and ever-morphing problem of electromagnetic radiation and health risks. My involvement in this project or issue began in 1993 when, following a lawsuit that was brought by a husband whose wife had died of a brain tumor, there were congressional hearings mandated in the United States. And during those congressional hearings, it became clear that cellular telephones, which at the time were being used by 15 million Americans and about 50 million people around the world, had been exempted from pre-market testing. In other words, cellular phones were not tested for safety before they were put into commerce. The reason for this, as came out in the hearings, was that the cellular phone industry had received this variance from the Food and Drug Administration based on the recognition that cellular phones transmitted at very low power, and that at the time, the only mechanisms of harm that were known had to do with heating of biological tissue, to wit, microwave oven studies. And based on that low power exclusion, cellular phones were exempted from any type of safety testing before they went into the marketplace. Because there had been questions raised about whether or not cellular phones could be a cause of brain cancer, the Congress turned to the Food and Drug Administration and asked them, what are you going to do about this? Because as I mentioned at the time, there were 15 million Americans using a device now which had been exempted by the government from safety testing and about which safety questions were being raised. In the United States, the Cellular Telecommunications and Industry Association stepped forward and offered to fund research that would be intended to fill the data gaps that were there because there was no pre-market testing. And in exchange for that, the Food and Drug Administration agreed not to regulate them. I was the person who was charged with running that program. I was given $28.5 million in 1993. The money was put into a trust. An interagency government working group was put in place to oversee the work. At the Harvard School of Public Health, we enlisted an independent peer review board to peer review all of our work at the protocol stage, at the data analysis stage, and at the final report stage. The paradigm that we followed was the regulatory paradigm that would be applicable to a consumer device like a cellular phone that releases radiation. So pre-market testing for safety, post-market surveillance to make sure that mistakes were not made in the pre-market testing. We set about doing that work following appropriate in vitro, in vivo models in the pre-market testing phase, as well as the development of new exposure systems based on the dosimetry of how people actually use cellular phones. We also set up a series of epidemiological studies that at the time we intended would give us baseline information, but that indeed is the beginning of what a post-market surveillance program should look like. We went forward with that program with more than 200 doctors and scientists from around the world participating. In 1999, we came forth with our findings, and there were several findings that we did not expect. We were able to confirm, for example, that cellular phone radiation, near-field radiation, caused leakage in the blood-brain barrier. We identified for the first time genetic damage caused by non-thermal radiation. That genetic damage was exhibited by the presence of micronuclei in human blood. We also found in our epidemiological studies more than a doubling in the risk of neuroepithelial tumors among people who use cellular phones when compared to people who did not use cellular phones. At the time we had these findings, we went both to the Food and Drug Administration and to the cellular telephone industry, and we suggested strongly that they let the public know what was found. Their response was that they didn't feel that the data were strong enough to warrant a public warning. Thank you for your work. We'll take it from here. We felt that that was not an appropriate response to $28.5 million of research. We went public with the findings on our own, and in the time frame of 1999 to 2001, there was a very famous worldwide split between the scientists who had conducted that work with the $28.5 million and the cellular phone industry. While I was head of that industry's research program, I was sued a couple of times by people who had brain tumors. And I was brought into those lawsuits on the premise that I was withholding information from the public about the dangers of cell phones. When we published our findings, and subsequently I have 3 books now that are out on the subject, it became clear that we were not holding anything back. The plaintiff lawyers came to us and asked whether or not I wanted out of the lawsuit. And a settlement was reached where we gave the plaintiffs $1.25 million, which was what was left on our insurance policy, and they gave us back $250,000 in cash to set up a post-market surveillance registry. Based on setting up that registry, we established the Safe Wireless Initiative. Now, the Safe Wireless Initiative is a project in the nonprofit Science and Public Policy Institute. The Science and Public Policy Institute was established in 1992, and over that time frame was involved in a number of projects involving public education and public health. We were, for example, responsible for overseeing how commercials for smoking cessation were to be conducted following the settlement between the attorneys general in the United States and the tobacco industry. With the $250,000, we put in place a post-market surveillance registry which, had the regulatory authorities been taking regulatory steps, would have been put in place anyway. It's important to understand that in the United States today and in Great Britain today, cellular phones and wireless technology are not regulated for safety. Because of that dearth of regulation for safety, we established within the Safe Wireless Initiative a continuation of the work that we had first embarked on with the $28.5 million from the wireless industry themselves. We have continued that work under the umbrella of pre-market testing, filling those data gaps, trying to identify mechanisms of harm, and also trying to prescribe, based on understanding those mechanisms, primary, secondary, and tertiary interventions that would be appropriate for people who have been harmed by the radiation. So we have moved forward addressing this problem as a public health and safety problem with science aimed at identifying interventions. We do not look at this as a public relations problem. We do not look at this as a scientific debate problem. As others around the world may be doing research intended to cross the T's and dot the I's, and in effect count bodies, we are working on saving lives. So that is the context within which my remarks are made to you today. Now, what we understand now, today, from our work over the past 4 or 5 years, is the following. Within the electromagnetic spectrum, we now know that there are 3 very distinct effect windows. And in those 3 distinct effect windows, there are 3 distinct mechanisms of harm that operate to cause ill effects in some people. Within the ELF window, the extremely low frequency window, where the magnetic part of the electromagnetic field is dominant, the mechanism of harm is direct magnetic effect. There is a threshold within that window, meaning that there is a level below which there are no adverse effects. The threshold is breached when a large amount of power is used to push the ELF wave. At the high end of the electromagnetic spectrum, we have ionizing radiation. That's a different effect window. The mechanism of harm in the ionizing radiation effect window is high energy breakage of chemical bonds. That is a direct effect, and in terms of clinical response, we have a threshold. The effect window in between is the radio frequency radiation effect window. And what we have now found is that the raw radio frequency wave, 1900 megahertz, oscillating at 1900 million cycles per second. To be put in context, your heart beats at 2 hertz, 2 cycles per second. Radio signal beats at 1900 million cycles per second. Those high oscillations are not recognized by biological tissue. It is only because information has to be carried on those waves that data packets have got to be put on top of those waves in the form of modulations. That is why on either end of a phone call, you can hear voice, receive data, instead of simply hearing nothing. Those modulations form a secondary wave. We call that the information carrying radio wave, that secondary wave. And that information carrying radio wave oscillates in the radio frequency, depending on where you are, from low hertz to low kilohertz. That information carrying radio wave is recognizable by biological tissue. The mechanism of recognition is protein vibrational receptors on the cell membrane. Now, when a protein vibrational receptor recognizes an information carrying radio wave, it interprets that information carrying radio wave as a foreign invader to that cell. The reason is because in nature, information carrying radio waves do not exist. That we have not developed a compensatory system over evolution, the way we have for magnetic fields and also for ionizing radiation. When recognition occurs, which happens within milliseconds, within 3 to 5 seconds, the cell membrane interprets this information carrying radio wave as a foreign invader, and within 30 seconds, a series of biochemical reactions ensue which are intended to help the cell protect itself. Among the first of those biochemical reactions is a sliding of the protein and lipid layers on the cell membrane, which closes down the active transport channels. So the cell membrane becomes less permeable, and nutrients are now able to get into the cell. When nutrients cannot get into the cell becomes energy deficient. And we have now seen that when a cell becomes energy efficient, the first thing that is compromised is microtubule-based intercellular communication, photon communication between cells. Cells cease to be able to talk to each other. This is very important because on a cellular molecular basis, when cells are able to talk to each other and do work together, they form tissue. And when tissues are able to talk to each other and do work together, they form organs. And when organs are able to talk to each other and do work together, they form organisms. And when you disrupt that process of intercellular communication, you cause symptoms instantaneously. So the disruption of microtubule-based intercellular communication is the first thing that happens when the protective responses at the cell membrane level ensue. While nutrients cannot get into the cell, waste product cannot get out of the cell. And as waste product builds up inside the cell, you have increase in concentration of free radicals. Those free radicals are highly reactive. And like the free radicals in the 60s, they love a party, and the party in the cell is going on at the mitochondria. So the first place those free radicals go are to the mitochondria, which is the respiratory center of the cell. Buildup of free radicals disrupts mitochondrial function. And when the cell cannot function properly, it can't do its job. And when the cell can't do its job, it's a dysfunctional cell. So one pathway of the mechanism of the buildup of free radicals is cellular dysfunction. This is consistent with what we found, for example, in leakage of the blood-brain barrier. The other thing that happens is that you have high concentrations of free radicals floating around in the cytoplasm, the inside the cell. And on the endomembrane, the protein inside the cell, you have messenger RNA. And when the cell is chronically under this state of stress, where the active transport channels are shut down, it changes the way messenger RNA folds. The messenger RNA takes that information that the cell is under siege and converts it to the DNA in the mitochondria and the DNA in the nucleus. You have an environmentally induced genetic change. And when that cell goes through mitosis, the daughter cells carry the new genetic information. As that process continues, and over several cell cycles, you have daughter cells with information indicating that they are under siege when they may be not. You have a clinical syndrome called electrohypersensitivity. That is the mechanism for electrohypersensitivity. When the free radicals interfere with DNA repair in the cytoplasm, you have fragments of DNA that are not able to recombine properly. We have found, and others have found, that those fragments of DNA that can function well enough to form a membrane around themselves form what we call micronuclei. Micronuclei are pieces of DNA in the cytoplasm of the cell. They have membranes around themselves, but they have no constructive purpose. They have no constructive function. When the cell goes through a process called apoptosis, apoptosis is programmed cell death. When a cell knows it can no longer do its job, it commits suicide to make room for a new cell to come in and start up the work. When that happens, the cell membrane disintegrates, and micronuclei that are inside the cell are now released into the interstitial fluid between cells. Under normal circumstances, micronuclei would be recognized as a foreign substance, and a message would be sent to the immune system to recruit macrophages and T cells to come and take the micronucleus away. But this is not a normal circumstance because the cell is energy deficient. Intercellular communication is compromised, so the message doesn't get to the immune system. So now you have a micronucleus sitting in the interstitial fluid that is nutrient rich because nutrients could not get inside the cell. And now that micronucleus is free to clone and to proliferate. And that is consistent with the mechanism we have for the development of tumors. Where you have a biological mechanism like this that is triggered by recognition at the cell membrane level, you have no threshold. Meaning, there is no level below which this mechanism is not triggered. What we have done in the Safe Wireless Initiative is to use this information to identify ways that we can intervene so that people do not have to suffer from the effects of information-carrying radio waves. Our paradigm for intervention is the public health paradigm. And that includes primary, secondary, and tertiary intervention. Primary intervention has to do with eliminating the exposure. Secondary intervention has to do with minimizing the effects or eliminating the symptoms. And tertiary intervention has to do with repairing the damage. There are now technologies available that offer primary, secondary, and tertiary interventions. Because those types of interventions are available, and because most of our work in the Safe Wireless Initiative is derivative of our registry, we have tens of thousands of reports now in our registry from people who believe that they have been harmed by electromagnetic radiation in all the different windows. And because our focus is on clinical information so that we can help patients, it was necessary for us to be available for consults for primary care doctors in the United States who were seeing patients with symptoms that they didn't understand. And the scenario was sort of sad because doctors were calling in and saying, look, you know, I've had this fellow as a patient for 10 years, and I think he's lost his mind. And after understanding the mechanistic basis for electrohypersensitivity, then the doctor is able to now understand interventions, therapeutic interventions. And because word got out that we were doing those consults, it was impossible to do them on a one-on-one basis. So we established a certification program for primary care clinicians in the United States, and we call that the CIRSA program, Certified Electromagnetic Radiation Safety Advisors. And we're holding that certification course now once a month for primary care practitioners and other professionals in the United States. Now, primary intervention, eliminating the exposure, used to be something that we could talk about relative to cellular phones. Because in the old days, and remember this is high technology, so the old days is 2001. In the old days, we could make a distinction between the near-field plume from a cellular phone antenna, which was about 6 or 7 inches around the center of the dipole antenna, where the highest concentration of information-carrying radio waves would be, and the far field, which was the field where the intensity of the signal would dissipate. What's happened now, in the past few years, is that the number of people using cellular phones in the world has risen to 2.2 billion. In communities around the world, they're going to wireless WiMAX. There are Wi-Fi in almost all the major airports, all the major hotels. There are some groups who are even considering putting Wi-Fi in schools. Now, when you understand the mechanism of harm, information-carrying radio waves, wherever you have information on a radio wave, you can trigger the cell membrane response. There is no threshold. And the background level of information-carrying radio waves is now indistinguishable in most major cities from the near-field plume on a cellular phone. We have a major problem. And our recommendation, and the recommendation that we are now pushing to have implemented in communities around the United States, is this. that we have to have an alternative infrastructure to wireless. The alternative that we recommend is fiber optic. So that we want to increase fiber optic spine and decrease the amount of wireless transmission. When you have a distributed system like that, you can apply primary prevention technology to every transmission node. And you can also apply primary prevention technology to the point of use. And our feeling is that over a period of 5 years, if a gradual move is made toward fiber optic infrastructure in place of wireless infrastructure, that the background level of information carrying radio waves can be reduced by 90%. I'll stop there and take any questions you might have.
Thank you, Glenn. Right, I wonder if we can make the questions terse and sharp, you know, and reject the long stories of history and so on, so we can get some facts out here. Let me ask you the first question, George. Would I be forming micronuclei in my body, do you think? You know, even though I don't live near a telephone mast or use phones very avidly or whatever, despite this afternoon.
As a background.
Yes, I'm worried about, you see all these things are happening, but good science depends on good controls, where you've got an alternative, and you can see that what happens in relation to phones or radiation is happening to other people who don't use them. Okay.
It's very clear in the research that is published in peer-reviewed journals that the incidence of micronuclei following exposure to information-carrying radio waves is much higher than the background incidence of micronuclei. In fact, research this past year out of India shows that you can, with a mucosal scrape, pick up micronuclei in the mucus, mouth mucus, of people who use cell phones as compared to people who do not. So we're very confident that micronuclei are formed with the exposure, but more importantly is that when you intervene with something like a noise field technology, where the cell membrane recognition mechanism is inhibited, you do not have the formation of micronuclei. So that sometimes the best proof that it's there is the ability that you can take it away.
Okay. Yes, say who you are, not who you are, but
BBC medical correspondent. Could you tell me what did you make of James Rubin's study in the BMJ and other studies he's done, where he did a double-blind placebo trial of people who said they were sensitive to mobile phone signals, and he couldn't find any evidence of that? And can you point to me any similarly robust trials that show the opposite?
Okay, well, our experience with our registry is that, and our experience with clinicians who treat these patients, I think it's a very different database from the database that's in a constructed trial, is that the different exposure windows impact different people in different ways. And there are different pieces of those exposure windows, different frequencies that may trigger responses in some people and not trigger responses in other people. The other thing that we have is that the mechanism of harm that we now understand, which is disrupting intercellular communication, can lead to a whole host of different pathologies. It's a fundamental pathological deficit that we're inducing here. So that when I look at the studies that attempt to control the type of response that you might get from a fundamental pathological disruption, I think that you would have to design a study that would be able to look at hundreds upon hundreds of alternative exposure effect responses. I don't think it's possible. And that's why we have focused our efforts on dealing with the doctors. Because what happens when a doctor is going through a differential diagnosis, he'll try something, and then it won't work. And then he'll try something else, and then it might work a little better. And then he'll try something else, and then it'll work. That type of information is only gatherable at the clinical intervention level. And with a moving target like electrohypersensitivity, we feel that that's the only way that we're going to get information soon enough to help patients. Now keep in mind, our orientation is not research. We are trying to help patients. We are trying to provide recommendations for intervention. And in the public health paradigm, one of the basic tenets has always been that you need to be able to understand enough about a disease process to be able to prevent it. And that is the baseline that we follow.
You want to come back?
Do you understand how difficult it is when evidence-based medicine is what we are all supposed to go on? What you put forward today is very, very worrying. And then, as you say, there are thousands of people who report these symptoms, but without trials which can show prove what you're showing. I mean, you have basically a theory.
Well, no, I don't have basically a theory. We have clinical data. And let me respond. I think that you hit on something very important. What you need here in the UK is a post-market surveillance system. You need a program that brings clinical data into the hands of the decision makers in an objective way. Because it is simply not viable to have researchers who are not dealing with patients who have these symptoms to try to construct reasonable hypotheses. It just doesn't work. So that what you need is perhaps Dr. Chalice and the money that he's going to be putting together here can set aside something for the clinicians. You see, this is a medical problem. It's not a physics problem. It's not a science problem. This is a medical problem because you have people who are sick. And I think that if you are going to be responsive to the needs of public health, then a post-market surveillance registry certainly should be part of what is recommended.
Is that okay, Beth? Okay, well, okay. Hands up, please, who wants to say that? Gosh, right. Alan, you're going to say something then, Andrew. I'll move around here, then over this way. Okay, I'll come back here. Alan, I can't ever shut you up, so please.
I'd like to ask...
Stand up, please, and tell us, say who you are.
I'm Connor from the Radiation Research Group. Really thanks to Dr. Carlo and Inga for sharing this. I'd just like to ask, with the amount of different frequencies that I'm living with, such as tetra and wireless and all foam masks, what's the overlapping of all this technology? What will that do to us?
Well, understanding the mechanism, we know that when you have information-carrying radio waves, that you are able to trigger the cell membrane response. So that if you have several sources of information-carrying radio waves, you're going to trigger more cell membrane response. So it's additive.
Okay, Andrew?
Andrew Miller, Member of Parliament. Two short questions, if I may. The first is, you'll be aware that in the field of research around ionising sources, one of the most difficult debates there has been determining whether there is a low level threshold of acceptance or not. That's been going on within the OECD for some 20 years. I've been part of it. I've spoken to two conferences myself. Yet you seem to rather rapidly have come to a determination that there is no low level threshold, safe threshold in this field. I'd like to see the scientific basis on which that decision has been arrived at. My second point is, in a sense following on from the observation just now, we live in the Western world in a world of electromagnetic sources, ranging from the vacuum cleaner, the washing machine, all the tools around our houses, fast-moving electric motors around us. How can you be certain that your American-based controls, living in that world, are genuinely controls? Would your science not be more credible if your controlled population were people who were not exposed to any of modern forms of electromagnetic source?
If you can find them.
Well, I mean, Africa, yeah.
So that kind of experiment may just not be possible.
Of course it's possible.
Oh, you think that? Is it possible?
Well, right now, I mean, I think that finding an area where you don't have information carrying radio waves is very difficult. You know, if you look at 50 years ago, we had radio waves, television signals, for example. And, you know, you'd have an antenna on top of a mountain that was carrying signals to the antenna on top of your house, and then it was hardwired. And what's happened with the information carrying radio waves of the cell phone is you brought those information carrying radio waves to the street. And there are virtually no areas where you have this technology where you do not have information carrying radio waves. And that is why we are so concerned. We have a paper coming out in about 45 days that draws a very strong correlation between exposure to information carrying radio waves and autism. And this will be the first paper that actually shows a mechanistic underpinning for that association. And our hypothesis there is that in the last 5 to 8 years, it is the high concentration of information carrying radio waves that is triggering autism in these young children who have a combination of genetic predisposition and a load of heavy metals that probably associated with vaccinations. And that when information carrying radio waves are triggering active transport channels shutting down, the metals get trapped inside the cells. And then you have the environmentally induced genetic change again that carries on to the daughter cells. We have clinical data that shows that when you take the electromagnetic radiation exposure away and you put these children through detox, very aggressive detox over a period of 40 to 50 weeks, that the heavy metals clear based on molecular weight. The lower molecular weight chemicals clear first, heavy metals, and then as the active transport channels open, you finally get mercury. And when mercury is eliminated, the symptoms begin to reverse.
Andrew? What do you think of that?
Well, I'm intrigued, but I still don't hear the answer because your controls seem to presuppose that any electromagnetic source that does not carry data is safe.
No, I'm not presupposing
That's my question.
Okay, so let me answer that. Up at in the ionizing radiation window, what we're assuming is that there is some threshold for clinical effects from ionizing radiation, because we're all exposed to ionizing radiation by background, lightning, radon, you know, that type of thing. So that our assumption there is that there must be some safe level that does not prescribe clinical disease, because we all don't have clinical disease and we're all exposed. So I'm talking about clinical, I'm not talking about disease mechanism threshold, clinical. The same is true in the ELF window. We know that the mechanism of harm in the ELF window is direct magnetic impact, and that impact is at the gap junction level, and it disrupts intercellular communication as a first level pathology. So that we have an understanding, but in both of those cases you have thresholds, practical clinical thresholds. But where you have an exposure that triggers a cell membrane reaction that is irreversible, you see what happens is that once the protein sensor recognizes the information carrying radio wave. Then the interpretation that this is a foreign invader, leading to the closing down of the active transport channels and the consequent disruption of inter-satellite communication, that's irreversible. So that all you need is recognition to begin the process.
Lauren Chalice, I'm chairman of the Programme Committee of UK's research in this area. I've been very interested in what you've had to say. One of my difficulties is that I understand that none of this has yet been published. You've given us a very detailed mechanism, and obviously that could be rather alarming. But we really need your work to go through the usual process of peer review, and then we can judge what we think about it. And we just can't really comment on it until we see that process. That's not just belief, it's the normal scientific process. And I know, for example, on the, you obviously, if the work is published, you're going to be giving us some fairly revolutionary numbers. For example, I'm not at this meeting, but I've seen your presentations which are on the web, TV interviews you've given, and you've spoken about eye cancer. Now, there have been 3 published studies on eye cancer, as you know. 2 of them found nothing. The one by Stang in Germany in 2001 was done on 18 cases. They found what was something they said was significant, but the author said the limitations of this study are such that we can draw no conclusion from it. So the published work on eye cancer is showing nothing. Now, if you have work on eye cancer that disagrees with that, we need to see it. We need to know. So I think, as far as I'm concerned, I'm just waiting until I see it all through peer review, and then I have a judgment on what you said. I think it's fair comment.
And that's fair. In the Safe Wireless Initiative, we're not about waiting. We jump out there so that we can help people. But your comments are fair. And as I mentioned this morning in our meeting, we have 6 papers now that are in various stages of process. Information on this cell membrane mechanism is in peer-reviewed literature. I mean, that's not my work. I'd love to take credit for it, but I can't. That's out there. The free radical work is out there. The inter-cellular communication work is out there. So don't make the conclusion here that we're just guessing. We're not guessing at all.
What are you going to do about it, Professor Johnson? What research?
All right. Michael Park keeps saying there is no evidence.
Go on.
We're sick of it.
Tell it as it is. Go on.
We have done volunteer studies. 6 volunteer studies, and they are, I hope all of them will be published by May. And not all of it yet has been peer reviewed, but the indications are that neither on sensitives or on controls are we seeing any short-term effects. We looked at a wide range of physiological effects and content. Now, maybe we're doing the wrong experiment, but they will be reported and people can comment and give us advice on the right experiments. So that's the short term. Now, the difficulty is that short-term effects don't necessarily tell us what long-term effects. There have been 2 recent epidemiological studies, one on glioma, which is malignant brain cancer, one on acoustic neuroma, which is a benign cancer just outside the brain on the acoustic nerve. Both these are finding an increased risk. However, the authors of both of these say, A, it's barely significant, you couldn't do it to chance. You are asking people who are ill to remember how much they actually use the mobile phone for. Not easy. And even the statistical says this could be a 4% chance it could be due to chance. 4% possibility. The other possibility is recall bias. You're asking somebody who's ill to remember which side of the phone, which side of the head they use the phone. And we know from other sources that sometimes there's an inclination to want subconsciously to blame a cause on an effect. So there may be a bias which says, well, I use it this side where the tumor is, do I? So what the authors of these papers have said is there may be an effect we need to follow it through, and I entirely agree. So to answer Dr. Gibson, one thing we're doing is to recommend that we carry out an epidemiological study which is free from bias and which will pick up other diseases, not only brain cancer and acoustic neuroma, but Parkinson's, Alzheimer's, motoring, neurone disease, all sorts of diseases that might be affected by mobile phone. And I believe that's very important. The other thing we want to do is look at children. And you've already commented on children. I entirely agree that children are much more sensitive to a whole range of what medics call insults, things like lead, pollution, things like ionizing radiation, they react differently, things like skin, sunlight, they react differently. Possibly even, as you say, there is some epidemiological evidence of childhood leukemia being affected by magnetic fields. It's still uncertain, but the evidence is there, we have to explore that. So I think we want to look at children. So those are the two priorities I think the UK should be looking at. There are a number of others. And maybe from discussions I've had this morning that we shall have some ideas of what more we can do on sensitives. Which obviously is an issue at the moment. We've done what we can. Maybe we haven't done the right things. We need to talk more and think about it. So to answer that, please, that's what we want to do.
Where's the money coming from to do those kind of research?
So we're looking for, we want, as we do with the MTHR program, we want to have joint funding from government and industry with a file. As we did in the present MTHR program, we tell sponsors, different government agencies, different industrial companies, broadly what we want to do. We can't expect them to fund things unless they do broadly what they want to do. Once they've signed the contracts on that basis, they have no role whatsoever to play in the choice of the programs, in the management of the programs, the publication of the data. We're completely firewalled from our sponsors and both industry and government who want it that way because people don't believe research is funded by either of the sponsors.
So be independent, yeah.
We must be independent, and I think we are.
Okay, yes.
Can I have responded?
You hang on to this, and I'll let you come back to it, yeah. Because I want to give the public in. Yes, ma'am, and
I'm Mary Josley from Batman, which is Banbury Against Telephone Mass Association Network. In view of the fact the government receives in excess of £1 billion per annum in tax from mobile phone companies, what do you think it will take to get legislation in place to site masts further away from schools and residents? While I'm here today, they're actually siting a 50-foot mast 50 metres away from the paper.
okay, all right. Yes, and the woman behind, yes, with the camera, yeah.
My name is Sheila Johnson. I'm a neuroscientist. I have a PhD from the University of Iowa, and I've been following radiation research for 11 years. And I consult for people all over the world, including governments, research groups, and anybody. And in 1999, as George Carlo said, he had some results. A lot of them weren't published until well into the 2000s, and some of them were never published. And since the day that he finished at WTR, this research has continued. And it's been continued under the FDA, and they've had future micronuclei studies to look for the mechanism. And the FDA, under Howard Steer and Avi Destra, have concluded that there is no evidence that micronuclei are indeed formed by radio frequencies. And this is in the published literature. And so this mechanism that Dr. Carlo talks about bases on research that wasn't published yet, and he doesn't seem to refer on to the future research. And I just have a question for Dr. Carlo. In your healthcare program that you set up, have the FDA licensed your education program to the medical practitioners?
Okay. Keep them all together. I'll take them in batches. Okay. Thank you very much. We'll get an answer in a second. Robert.
Thank you. Rob Flello, Member of Parliament for Stoke-on-Trent South. Being a constituency MP, I have a sort of strange pull on me from two directions. On the one hand, I try not to be in any way scaremongering and worry people unduly. But equally, I'm faced with a situation where residents come to me from the southeast part of my constituency with a map. And on that map, they've drawn the phone mast and very carefully aligned on that map where the main parts of the beam from the 3 antennae are. And then overlaid onto that map is a survey they've done of local residents, putting blobs on for where people with brain cancers, ear cancers are. And you look at the map, and they're in exact alignments. And so I go to the National Statistics Office and ask for details in the area of different illnesses. We don't take the data. I go to the research material. The research is ongoing. So what do I say to my constituents? Should I tell them that you're right to be concerned, or should I be saying that you're absolutely right? Forgive me, I didn't quite catch your name, but in terms of the research that should be being done, should I say it's very important the work should be being done, but it isn't at the moment? What should I be saying to my constituents?
There's a big difference between research on cause and effect and public health intervention work. Our job in the Safe Wireless Initiative is public health intervention. We're moving forward based on our clinical and scientific understanding so that we can help people. That research you should be supporting. That type of work. Unfortunately, from what I understand, in the UK right now there's no one doing this type of work. That the only work ongoing has to do with cause and effect. And as the question from Sheila indicates, there are 9 peer-reviewed papers showing micronuclei for radiation. I'll show them to you. Now, the argument about how many angels can dance on the head of a pin is not one that I want to be involved in. We're about intervening to save lives, period. That's our job. We have to apply science. Sometimes it's imperfect. Doctors do that every day. So that as you put your program together here, you need to understand that the very important work that Dr. Chalice is doing, and we don't agree on everything, obviously, but he's a good man.
Well,
that work. That work is very important, but that's causation research. And that has a place. But what we're talking about here is intervention for diagnosis and intervention. Diagnosis and intervention research. That's what you need. That's why a post-market surveillance registry is absolutely necessary. Absolutely necessary, especially since there are no safety regulations by a safety agency on cell phones. In the United States, the FDA has not intervened with regard to cell phones. Another point, the FDA is not in the business of sanctioning any education programs. When people come and apply, we go to their continuing medical education board to give them the credit.
And what about the
So
This is the medical board.
we're doing what we have to do for every individual to get their continuing medical education. This would be a good course, by the way, for you to come to, and I think we're going to hold one here in the UK. You can sit in the front row, Sheila.
All that, Sheila.
Okay. Did I answer your question?
He's not an Iowan, Joey.
I'd like to ask, do you think that the mobile phone industry has deliberately concealed evidence that demonstrates the causal link between mobile phone radiation and cancer, and taken calculated steps to promote public belief that it is completely safe, while knowing this to be false?
Okay, that's a fair question, yeah. Yes, sir? No, I did.
Rod Reed, electrosensitivity support charity for electrical health sensitives. I talk daily to people who are made ill by electromagnetic fields and communication radio frequencies. And what is almost worse for them is the isolation and the mockery that they receive as psychotic crap, as one professor called it last year. And listening to Michael Clark of the HPA constantly on the media saying there is no evidence that what you are suffering has this cause. We think there is lots of evidence. When I have personally had a go at Michael over this, as I tend to, and as my sufferers want me to, he says to me, well, there's no scientifically proven evidence. And I say, well, it would be something if you said that on it. But he doesn't. He says there's no evidence. Do you think it would be a good idea, in the light of the evidence that is known, clinical and otherwise, that the government takes steps to disallow Wi-Fi being installed in schools where there are young people?
Okay,
Hi, I'm Elizabeth Wells, freelance writer and electrosensitive. My question follows on from this lady's, I suppose. In a way, it seems a bit of a chicken and egg situation. We're not all electrosensitives, although we are all exposed pretty much to the same amount of radiation. So I just wondered, in your opinion, how much of it is about people who are already immune compromised developing electrosensitivity, or how much is it being exposed to electrosensitivity causes people to become immune compromised?
Okay, and the last one, then I'm going to take another last bunch of questions, but then we've got to get out of here. Right.
My question is similar to one of these actually I was going to ask. Since more than half of the schools in the UK have Wi-Fi, what would you expect to see effects on children being, and what advice would you give to government?
Easy.
Okay. As I can remember, then maybe moving backwards. The difficulty with the Wi-Fi in the schools is that this is the most vulnerable population, this is the highest risk population, and that's an experiment that should not be conducted. Now, we have just completed some work in a community called Rancho Santa Fe in California. And next to this school, it's not a Wi-Fi in the school, but next to the school there's a base station with 8 or 9 antennas. And we've done readings and we found information carrying radio waves all around the school playground. And the antenna concentration is as recent as 5 or 6 years ago. And this school, Rancho Santa Fe, is the most wealthy community in America. It's movie stars and professional athletes. That school was the #1 elementary school for 20 years in California. And in 2003, it dropped to #7, and in 2005, it dropped to #9. Now, if you're in the business of looking for canaries in the coal mine, you have them there. So when you're looking at the types of responses that you would expect, disruption of intracellular communication leads to things like attention deficit, not being able to focus, sleep disruption, behavioral problems, all of those things. So if you want to do a quick sample, take a look at the records of those things in your schools and compare those that have Wi-Fi and those that do not, those advanced and those that do not, because the mechanism suggests that those are the kinds of things that you can see. Okay. You don't have to convince me, I believe. And that's why here in the UK, you need a clinical intervention program. You need a post-market surveillance registry and a clinical intervention program so that people like you can be taken care of with your doctors while other folks are trying to do the research that crosses the T's and dots the I's. You can't wait for them.
Sorry about it, just to add, I'm suffering and I feel, sometimes I got COVID pain, but I feel for my 4-year-old daughter. We moved when my daughter was 1 year old. She came with rash, her arms bleeding with rash. The doctor couldn't take away the rash. We had to go away to cottages to, spend money to be away from the house. Then she started hearing a sound. Listen to all of you. The mouse, all of these masks, they cause a sound, a pulsing sound. It was like a bee was in her ears. She said, Mommy says, in her coat, she couldn't She couldn't sleep. She woke up about up to 15 times a night saying, Dr. Charles, I'm telling you please to help us. Because she said, Mom, there is the wind in my ears. There is a plane in my pot. Please, Mom, take it away. I have to put a radio on the thing. I'm sorry I'm emotional, but what do I do with my daughter? She's covered in rash. When I take her to Peru, to South America, her body clears. The doctor has checked it. Her doctor says, I can't help you. There is no guidelines in the NHS. He says, we can't help you. Go back to the Health Protection Agency. Health Protection Agency says, go back to your doctor. Where do I go now? I've been Health Protection Agency, doctor, Sweden. Professor Hans says it's very easy to prove that your daughter suffers from electromagnetic radiation because a simple test that costs 2,000 pounds, he will prove it. He says, I'll do it for you, but he says you have to go to the government, and I'll do it when the government, to be validated by the government. Please help me. Please help me. I'm in pain.
I also added to about the rocks, I think. Okay. And then the one behind is yellow, the freelance.
I answered you together, is that okay?
Okay. And then there's a name over this side. I'll come back to this.
Okay, the settlement, you know, I didn't do anything that was culpable in that situation. The industry was standing behind me with their defense. They said, see, we gave money to this guy, and he did the research, and he's out there blabbing about it. And that's why the plaintiffs wanted to settle. And I felt that simply giving the plaintiffs money without doing something constructive for everybody else was not a good way to go. And that's why we asked for the money to set up the registry. The question about the 3G. One thing that we're doing in communities in the United States now, that we're working with those homeowners to put in fiber optic bypasses so that, you know, it goes back to a common law theory of criminal trespass. If the radio wave is something dangerous and you don't want it on your property, then, at least in the United States, you can bring criminal trespass actions against the heads of the companies who have the responsibility. And what's possible is to establish a shield and then a fiber optic bypass around your property so that you do not have to have those radio signals in your property. If a whole street of homeowners works together in the same manner, now you have a fiber optic bypass around the whole community, and before you know it, you can tie that into the fiber optic infrastructure you already have in place, and before you know it, you have a fiber optic spine, and then you are able to have a distributed antenna system with noise field protection at the nodes. This is a solvable problem. It is not necessary for people to be sick from this technology.
I'm very, very interested on the technology. I'm very pleased to hear how guests. From any lawyers, where the notion of criminal trespassing will be allowed.
Quickly, then I'm going to really bother some place.
I want to answer the question. There's litigation ongoing in the United States now. There are 7 different class action lawsuits that have been brought. There are 7 different personal injury lawsuits that have been brought. And the basis for those lawsuits is that the industry knew and they lied about it. Evidence in those lawsuits show that while on the one hand the industry is filing for a patent that says we need a shield inside the phone because these radio waves are dangerous, and at the same time, during the same year, in the phone user's manual, when you buy a new phone, it says there are no studies that indicate that cell phones are dangerous. Now, I want to raise one other point. Again, this highlights the difference between research and clinical intervention. Research and intervention. There are a number of published epidemiological studies out there, as Dr. Chalice has pointed out. From a research point of view, Dr. Chalice and others look at that and they parse the data. They say, well, it was only marginally statistically significant there, and that's what researchers are supposed to do. It's what they do for a living. When we look at those studies from an intervention point of view, we know that in those published epidemiological studies, there are more than 300 statistically significant increases reported between cancer and benign tumors and cell phone use. There are more than 300 findings reported in those studies? I know you're shaking your head. Sheila, you're shaking your head. No. The answer is yes. You don't count them. Now, from a surveillance point of view, we look at that and we say that means we need intervention.
Okay, let's have 3 last questions. 1, 2, 3, 4, and that's it. Okay? Right, 1.
I'm very concerned that Dr. Douglas hasn't considered the German research findings. Professor Carlo Westminster done a summary of 1,500 studies in Russia looking at EMFs and the genesis of EMFs. There are plenty of studies. I'm drowning in the stuff because I'm getting them all the time and I can't translate them all. And they all show effects, similar to those effects Dr. Carlo has mentioned. But there seems to be nobody who is able to translate it in this country.
I'll let you come back. Yes.
My name is Tom Priest and I live on the base stations of Hutchison, Orange and Vodafone. I went on the roof the other day in Oxford. My blood pressure afterwards went down to 117, 70. The next day it was 180, 120. I'm just wondering, does it have an effect on the heart when you go up there?
Okay, and Ms. Duvier, yes.
I'm a householder, and in our community there's masks getting put up all the time, and we're constantly fighting the masks. My son and I have got bone marrow damage, and I want Dr. Chalice to tell me that I am safe in my house.
Right, and the woman behind, please, yes.
I'm just going to make the point that in this country we have huge resistance to this process benefit. And there's too much reliance on the word science at the moment and not enough epidemiological studies of the environment. And people, the public, like Sylvia and many other people in this room, have come up against the planning boards in this country over and over and over again, which sends them round and round in circles because at the moment the public is not being safeguarded by our planning authorities because they are not, for some reason, the legislation to change to full planning rather than full provisional isn't being taken seriously. And furthermore, I come across local councils are very ill-informed, as are their planning departments, and they make the wrong decisions when the public confers their concerns. And the other trap that is happening in this country is that local councils fear opposing the siting of communications masts installations, because when corporations appeal against them, they have to pay the costs. And so it's a passive form of control in local authorities who fear opposition. And so what I'd like to see the government do is to enable local authorities to make independent decisions without fear, by covering, if they have to, by covering the costs of those opposition.
Somebody would like to know who you are, please. Could I ask you to identify yourself? Sorry.
My name is Karen Mason Robertson. I made a DVD about the concerns, the issues surrounding mobile telephony in 2005 with film about.
Where are you from? Whereabouts do you work?
I'm just a member of the public.
But you live somewhere, and
I live in Wiltshire.
Wiltshire, right? Okay, thank you. Well done, right. So you're on. Dr. Chalice, come on. There's been 2 chat
I'm not sure what I'm supposed to respond to, except that's just saying that it's the Health Protection Agency, it's the government, it's the medical officer that makes the decisions. I really am concerned with deciding what is the most important research we need to do. So that's my role, and to analyse, to help with others, many others, to help decide, as George Carlo said, to try and sift through the large number of papers and the huge amount of literature that comes out and try and decide what is wrong, because it's not being replicated, what is right and what is uncertain. If something uncertain, we try and base the research.
Well, the question was specifically about Germany, I think.
About the Russian
About the Professor Hicks' translation of the
again,
studies in Russian.
that sort of review of the work will be actually to another body I'm on, but don't speak for, which is the advisory group of non-ionizing radiation of the Health Protection Agency. We review all the work that comes out about every 3 years. And if there is work that is legible to us, it's readable to us, then obviously it's included in the review.
He
But I don't
doesn't
think many of
have
us
the
think
money
right.
translation.
Sorry?
You don't. Why he invented it? Why don't just translate the material instead?
Well, you better ask the Health Protection Agency, not me.
I'm sure they could get some. You do. But yes, okay. Listen, the last, the woman behind. You had a question for Dr. Charles. Yeah.
Right, yeah. How can you possibly help us if you don't actually study us? When I've been to doctors with my health problem, my son's, all these days, they haven't actually asked me what caused it. They haven't even been interested.
Right.
Now, if they started to ask and I said there was maths everywhere, is that a possibility? And they say
Well,
no.
we are actually...
They don't know. They don't actually know because they don't ask. So you can't go anywhere towards helping us at all. So I want to know whether you're going to start studying people that have got actual health problems instead of...
Well, I'm not a medic, and most of the people on the committee are medics. We can't actually position to study people. What we can do is look at epidemiological study of masks. And we're doing that both by volunteer studies.
No one's asked me to volunteer, I'm sorry, but I would volunteer.
It has been widely advertised to volunteer in various studies that Elaine Fox is doing in Essex, and the lady over there was speaking about the sheep on it. Now, as far as epidemiological studies are concerned, we are also doing an epidemiological study of young children from masks. One of the big difficulties about studying masks is that if a disease is caused, it's probably caused 10 years or more before. Cancer takes at least 10 years after leukemia to appear. So what you need to know is what are the exposure of somebody at some unknown time, about 10 years ago. Masks will have changed, the person's house will have changed, their work may have changed, people travel. The only thing you can do at the moment is with young children, because they're more housebound and leukemia appears in a relatively short time. What we are doing though, and they've already spent money on, I think rightly, is a personal exposure meter. And that will tell us the exposure that somebody carrying this meter will do from all sources. So GSM, UNTS, Tetra, radio, television, etc. And we're trying that, we intend to carry on doing that in the hope that in the future we can do an epidemiological study of masks. Until we can do that, I think there's anything to do in epidemiology of masks.
Right, okay. You can have a fight with them afterwards, okay?
I just want to answer the question I asked in the first place. Can he reassure me that I'm completely safe from getting leukemia?
I can't reassure anybody that is safe from impossible.
No, but he knows that it will contribute to any further illness I have.
Right, okay, look. George is going to summarise in a minute, but there's a man there really bugging me. I know he's sure he's there.
Brian Steve, seriously electrical executive of the businessman. I understand what problems people have. However, over the next 2 years, it transpires that these people are right, and George Carlo was right. And we've ignored them, and ignored them, and ignored them, and ignored them. Who's going to be responsible?
Yes. Yeah, absolutely.
The reason that we're interested in this is trying to find out and take it forward, and we're all doing little bits, and we've got constituents of battles away, and we do it, and we talk to ministers about planning rights and so on. And you can see it kind of moving, but not fast enough from the point of view of people like you. And, you know, we've got to get a lot of our colleagues on side too. So every one of you's got a local MP that you should go and talk to sensibly about it, and, you know, see if you
They don't listen.
They don't
ignore
listen.
you. They say there is no evidence because Michael Clark of the HPA says there is no evidence.
Well, I can think of lots of things. I'm not going to mention Bernard Matthews here, but
And Professor Hyland says it's an obscene spectacle when Michael Clark is sent to public meetings.
Okay, I know the problem. It is
Michael Clark says that their company is independent. They're being paid by the phone companies.
How many MPs are here? Would they raise their hands to see how many MPs are here?
One or two in and gone.
With 10 lobbyists to every MP. No MPs yet?
Well, there's Andrew's stuck in the middle there, and he's interested enough, and he's into IT technology and stuff. Richard was an MP when he was a nice chap.
Is that because most of them don't want to be able to be held to account by knowing?
They don't want to know.
If they're seen to know what happened, they can then be held to account later. Is that why there are so few MPs here?
Right, okay, all right, that's the point. Are you all right, Brian? You okay? You made your point and you've got that. So George is going to sum up in 2 minutes, and I mean 2 minutes, and then Eileen wants to say something and try and move something. Okay?
In summary, first, thank you very much for inviting me, and I'm very honored to be able to be here. The thing that I'm observing is that people are asking researchers to do things that researchers don't do. Yes. And it's because you have something missing. You do not have the program that allows for doctors and treating doctors to be able to take the information and apply it efficiently and readily to patients. You need to have a different place to deal with clinical argument, diagnosis, intervention, and scientific argument. Patients should never be victimized by situations where scientists are mixing it up. I mean, I love to mix it up with Dr. Johnston and with Dr. Chalice, but that should never compromise patient care. And what's missing here is the clinical intervention research program that is necessary to address those clinical needs that are real. Those are medical problems that you have that are not being addressed. There are research programs in place, but the research programs do not solve the medical problems. So my recommendation is that you consider expanding what you have and perhaps adopting something similar to what we have with our Safe Wireless project, with registries and interface with clinicians, and develop a database that's based on the medical presentations. And then at some point, that database interfaces with the research database, and you have your problem solved. Thank you.
Okay. Close.
Okay. Well, thank you again to Dr. Carlo and Ian Gibson and everyone for coming today. And I think we've all learned a lot, and we've got a lot of lessons to learn as well from what Dr. Carlo's done. And I'm going to have to whisk him off quickly because we're off to Dublin tonight, and he's addressing all the Irish doctors tomorrow, and they've sponsored an event. We've got to rush off for a live press TV interview for one of their primetime shows that's going out tonight, so you probably won't be able to stay as long as you'd like to. But we've drawn up a resolution with the help of Alan Mayer, who's a lawyer who I'm sure most of you know. And this will give, I know we've only had 1 or 2 MPs in the room. Thank God we've had Ian Gibson and you've been along here. Andrew Mitchell's been here as well. But I think that's a pretty poor show, knowing how serious this problem is and how concerned we are as a public, and knowing that their postbags are full with our letters. So I'd like to give them one more opportunity, and I think everybody should take this to them. And we've drawn up a resolution from the Radiation Research Trust to urgently encourage all the government departments of health, all the committees, to urgently encourage the reopening of the Stewart report. And we want it to be reopened, looking urgently into addressing EHS, Wi-Fi in our schools, and the planning procedure, which is completely in chaos. And that needs to be as a matter of emergency. And the ideas that George has brought with us for our medical doctors to now be educated immediately to start dealing with the problems that we are suffering with, I think it's fantastic, and that's where it needs to go. So thank you.
Well, if you agree to that, I'll make sure that Bill Stewart gets it, okay? And we take it from there and we'll move it through government and through channels and see what happens, and we keep the issue. The issue is still alive, it's just very slow moving, that's all, from your point of view. So let's have a little bit of patience, and by this time next year, let's hope it's all solved. But there you go. Thanks very much all for coming. Thank you.